Newcastle United are the second team in a week to stop Manchester City claiming all 3 points in the Premier League this season. And in this video, we're going to dive into the tactical change that Eddie Howe made to his Newcastle side that stopped Manchester City getting into any kind of rhythm, but more importantly, gained Newcastle a very well-earned point. How are the lads? At this point, we know how Manchester City like to play and like to set up to break teams down, pushing their wingers really far and wide in an attempt to spread this Newcastle back line. And they did this with Bernardo Silva and Jack Grealish. But what they really wanted to do is occupy these spaces. And to do that, they used İlkay Gündoğan and Rico Lewis, moving them into these channels to be able to occupy those lanes between Dan Burn and Lewis Hall and Fabian Schär and Kieran Trippier. It was these lanes that they really wanted to try and occupy to make those blindside third man runs to really push through that Newcastle defence. Utilising Kovacic in possession and Erling Haaland leading the line, they were able to dominate the ball to a certain extent with Manuel Akanji lining up next to Kovacic, forcing Newcastle to regain a more defensive shape. The back three of Diaz, Walker and Gvardiol allowed them to really maintain their possession and then try to push through. But there was a problem, because Newcastle made a change. And the change was this. What do you see differently to the way that Newcastle were originally set up in that tactical piece? What you see is a back five. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But the fifth player is interesting, and that's the role that Joelinton played throughout the 90 minutes. Early on, we saw him dropping deeper next to Lewis Hall and Dan Burn, in particular between the channels that Rico Lewis and İlkay Gündoğan wanted to operate in. In this particular instance, he's out on this left-hand side. He doesn't mind doing that job for the side, making sure that he's aware of his opponent on the left of him, while also making sure that they're defensively solid at the back. But if we make sure that we see another thing here, in the tightness and close-knit capacity of this Newcastle setup, you've got Harvey Barnes, you've got Guimaraes, you've got Tonali, and you've of course got Murphy. Now what this does is it prevents Man City from utilising the space in the middle of the park, and it really reminds me of the way that Arsenal set up against Man City with that 5-4 setup, blocking the middle of the pitch, and that forces them out wide. But what then you've got is, with Newcastle's back five, it allows Kieran Trippier and Joelinton in this particular case, if Man City were to go wide, to be able to try and contest their 1v1 duels. And if they didn't win those, it's okay, because in the centre of the pitch, you've still got a good contingent of players to be able to deal with any kind of loose ball that might come their way. This prevented Man City from playing through the centre, but it also stopped them really from isolating duels out wide, and in the end they didn't really have too many answers. The role of Joelinton in this Newcastle side was a selfless one, and one that I thought Eddie Howe really utilised to perfection. In moving Fabian Schär out a little bit and Dan Burn centrally, it allowed for Joelinton just to move in between Dan Burn and Lewis Hall. Now originally what you're thinking is, yes, that makes Newcastle far more negative, but in actual fact what happens is this. Harvey Barnes tucks in, Murphy tucks in, and you've got Anthony Gordon as that sole striker. Like I said earlier, you're blocking out this central space, and it means that İlkay Gündoğan, when he moves centrally, and Rico Lewis cannot utilise these boxes, and they cannot utilise these spaces because there isn't any space. You can't play a pass into this area, because you're going to get closed down, you're going to have the Newcastle players converge on you, and it's going to be far too difficult to be able to do anything. The second thing that this allows is for Dan Burn to really go on to Erling Haaland. And at the same time, if Burn decides to step up or move away, you've then got another physical presence in Joelinton to be able to prevent that. So let's actually think up a hypothetical scenario. Jack Grealish has the ball out on this left-hand side, and if he decides to cross the ball in, what have you got? If Dan Burn doesn't fight with Haaland, you've then got another physical presence in Joelinton to be able to come round the back and just stop that. It allows Newcastle to be both aerially present, aerially dominant against one of, if not the Premier League's best centre forward currently, but at the same time it also blocks off those spaces that allow Manchester City to gain such a foothold in the opposition half. And this also leaves Lewis Hall onto Bernardo Silva and Kieran Trippier onto Jack Grealish. 1v1 duels that I think if you gave Newcastle the opportunity, they would take that and they wouldn't mind because they wouldn't be overloaded. They'd back themselves to win those duels, and they did. And in that case, it actually meant that Newcastle turned the ball over, and then once they did, they returned to a normal midfield three with Bruno Guimaraes, Tonali and Joelinton moving into midfield. This allowed them to have composure on the ball while also progressing forwards, utilising Murphy, Gordon and Barnes' pace to try and beat that high line of Manchester City, and they did it on a number of occasions. But that defensive setup utilising Joelinton was absolutely perfect. Here's another example of it. So you've got Jack Grealish receiving a pass right here out on this left hand side. Now what this back five actually does as well, notice where Joelinton is and his positioning with Erling Haaland. What this does in particular is it allows Kieran Trippier to come and contest. If Newcastle were in a back four, what you do is if Kieran Trippier then came and contested, you've got all this space for Fabian Schär to try and close. But in this particular scenario, if Rico Lewis makes a movement, if Gvardiol makes a movement, you've still got a couple of players to be able to deal with that. And it allows Newcastle to be so much more defensively resolute. In this current instance, you've got Jacob Murphy following the run, you've got Sandro Tonali, and just look at how compact they are. Murphy, Tonali, Guimaraes and Harvey Barnes, almost all within the width of the penalty area if you extended it outwards, and that's so important because these are the spaces that Manchester City want to play in. If a pass gets played through into Rico Lewis, you can't do anything because there are so many Newcastle players around him. You can't play into these channels anymore. And again, let's focus on that main man. Let's focus on Joelinton, on to Erling Haaland. He's really making a presence of himself. He's being that physical dominant figure, and what does that do? It frees up Dan Burn here to be able to follow his line, hold his line with his teammates, and be that architect of the defence. You've also got Lewis Hall on the other side following up in case he ever needs to come and contest Bernardo Silva. It was just defensively a masterclass by Newcastle, and in the end they did get their rewards for being that little bit braver on the ball in the second half. Let's talk about that goal, or the build-up to that goal, which I know was a penalty, but I thought the build-up play was absolutely essential. And I mentioned the word bravery a second ago, and you have to be brave when playing against this Manchester City setup. I mentioned the guy in Joelinton, the main man for me, the person who was selfless, but at the same time had the energy, the boundless energy, to be able to help his team whenever he needed to. I thought Anthony Gordon did that as well, just as a little shout out. But Joelinton on the ball right here, he's pressurised by not only Bernardo Silva but also Erling Haaland. He is stopping the pass over to Dan Burn, and then you're looking for that bravery. I mentioned that a second ago. He's going to play a pass into Bruno Guimaraes right here, who is again under pressure from Rico Lewis and Ilkay Gundogan, and it's a fantastic pass which allows Bruno Guimaraes to take it on the turn perfectly. Look at this. If you look at what he's doing right here, look at that turn. He's going to be able to turn around, and then you've got danger, because I want you to notice another thing. Take a look at Anthony Gordon right here. He's on his bike, he's moving. Yes, the Manchester City backline is very high, but if you take actually a look at their posture, if you take a look at how they're stood, they're not ready to run back towards their own goal. Only Gvardiol, I would argue, is actually in a motion to be able to turn. I don't think Akanji is particularly set well. I think Gvardiol is ready, and I don't think Ruben Diaz is either. And in fact, there's an interesting thing when you see this back, what happens with Ruben Diaz, because he doesn't follow the run. Instead, he looks for the offside. Just watch out for that one as well. But Anthony Gordon is ready to spin and around. It's a brilliant run, holding that offside line, and it is onside. Obviously, it was checked. And it was just fantastically worked. Bruno Guimaraes finds this pass, and you don't want to give him time or space. He's not really given too much, but he sees that pass and that run from Anthony Gordon round. Akanji isn't ready. He doesn't realise. Gvardiol sees it too late. Ruben Diaz, as I mentioned previously, isn't really there. And then what happens? You move it on, and look, Anthony Gordon is now free. Akanji is in panic stations, and you've got Ruben Diaz here, arguably Gvardiol as well, both calling for offside, both wanting that offside call. In the end, it's not offside. Kyle Walker is far too far away in no man's land, and you've got Anthony Gordon. And then the question becomes on this guy, because he has been fantastic, not only for Newcastle, he did very well for England when he made his little cameo. And then you're asking, what can he do next? Can he get something out of this situation? Ederson, one of the best goalkeepers in the Premier League, in a 1v1 situation, he is imposing, he is demanding, and Anthony Gordon does a fantastic job of going round Ederson and winning that penalty. If it's not given as a penalty, Anthony Gordon obviously slots it home, and he converts that penalty fantastically, and I think gives Newcastle massive reward for their hard-earned work. Eddie Howe's tactical nous really did shine through in this match, and defensively Newcastle were fantastic, but they also, as I said, had the bravery to take on Manchester City and carve themselves out a chance. It was fantastic. But of course, guys, let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. What did you think of Newcastle's display, and what did you think of Manchester City? I would love to hear from you, so please do get involved in the comment section below. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, hope you learned something new, and I hope to see you in the next one. But until then, my friends, take care.